Good afternoon and welcome. This is Dr. James Marion once again for our third Thursday live Facebook broadcast from Mount Sinai Medical Center and in the Zoom era from our various homes and rooms and offices. Today, we're going to be discussing COVID-19 vaccinations and IBD medications. And I have two wonderful guests. First is Serre-Yu Wong, MD, PhD, who is a researcher and instructor here in the Division of Gastroenterology, who's been doing some wonderful work. I get to work with Serre-Yu on a clinical basis all the time, but I love running into her in the hallway because she always asks questions that I'm not thinking of and wants to get into the clinical aspect, but also has a foot firmly grounded in the laboratory and in clinical research and in bench research. So Serre-Yu, it is so great to have you joining us.
Thank you.
And we have a repeat guest who I always love to have on our broadcast, Jean-Frederic Colombel. Dr. Colombel is the co-director of our Feinstein IBD Center, from which this broadcast emanates. COVID-19 vaccinations and IBD medications. Serre-Yu, I'm an IBD patient. I'm an IBD patient who, let's say, is on a biologic. Let's say I'm on an anti-TNF. Should I get vaccinated? And if so, which is the best one?
I have two very quick answers for that, but then I could give a longer answer. The first one is yes, you should. It's the one thing that we know that you can do to protect yourself, your loved ones, and those that you interact with. The second question is the best vaccine is the one that you get given first. Just get that vaccine when you can. The long answer to that is that we don't yet have comparative data about different efficacies for different vaccine types. And so again, but we know that they've been tested in the general population, and based upon that, we know that these can protect you from severe COVID, protect you from death from COVID. And so get your vaccine and get it when you can.
Right. And there's a little bit of a late breaking news story today about the Johnson & Johnson product being associated with some clots. However, to put this in perspective for our patients, and more data will be forthcoming, these were 7 events, 1 death and 1 serious illness out of 7 million vaccinations. So we're talking about extreme rarity. They're tapping the brakes on it now, but I would echo that. I will echo what Serre-Yu Wong has just said, which is best one is the one that can get in your arm. But really, doctor, though, the patients always ask this. Jean-Fred, do you have?
If I may, Jim, there is a lot of concern and anxiety about this Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca, because this is a concern for all my friends from Europe, for instance,
Right.
UK and France, where AstraZeneca is the main vaccine. There is definitely something associated, I think, with the adenovirus vaccine,
Right.
both the Johnson and the AstraZeneca vaccine. The mechanisms is becoming to be elucidated. I think this will be published soon. Again, these are very rare side effects,
Right.
but this has led to some specific recommendations actually in Europe.
Right. So I guess the question I was going to ask, though, and I get this all the time from my patients, but really, doctor, is there one, if all of them were available and you could just walk into any Walgreens and get them today, is there any one that you would have particular preference for your patients?
No, I would say, again, I would still say it's the one that's available to you first. There's no data comparing vaccines, right, and which ones will be more efficacious than the other. There will be data forthcoming about, their efficacy overall and time. But, even then, in general, these are probably going to, even if one is more than the other, there will be ways to counteract that. Even in the general population, they're already thinking about boosters, for example. So that would be my answer to that.
And Jim, I think we want to be very clear. The risk of COVID and bad COVID complications is much, much higher than any risk associated with any vaccine described so far. So if you have access to the vaccine, get it. Of
Yes.
course, we will discuss that because IBD patients were excluded from the clinical trials, but we have now more and more data, thanks in particular to Serre-Yu work on IBD patients that we could certainly discuss.
Yes. So I think that's going to bring us to the next topic. And again, Jean-Fred, completely agree with you. I mean, our hospital was filled to the rafters with 2,200 patients a day last spring with COVID. We're not seeing that with the vaccine. I always point that out to my patients. It's a very different thing. These are wonderful vaccines. So, Jean-Fred, let's say I'm an IBD patient and I've got my appointment and it's going to be 2 shots and I'm taking a biologic every 2 weeks or every 8 weeks or every 6 weeks, whatever you have me on. Should I hold my medications during this vaccination period? Should I continue them? Should I space them out a little bit? What are you telling your patients?
So continue your medications. I think continue your medication. Don't stop, don't hold, no drug holiday, don't space your infusion. We have data, and Serre-Yu could comment on that, especially for biologics which were given IV anti-TNF and vedolizumab, for instance, showing that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter when the vaccine is given as compared to the infusion. On the opposite, if you are holding your infusion or, for instance, spacing out, there is a risk of relapse of your disease when it's well controlled.
So this is late-breaking research, correct, Serre-Yu?
Yes, it is actually. We're quite excited, to be able to talk about it, especially because this is such an, I think, important question for so many patients, and understandably, because as Jean-Fred said, Dr. Colombel said, our patients were officially excluded from the trial. So we literally have no information, or had no information. And so here at Sinai, we actually have an ongoing study of IBD patients who come to our center for infusions. So we've actually been tracking our patients since May of last year, at the height of the pandemic during lockdown. And we've been collecting their blood and looking at, at antibodies that some of them have formed to the virus SARS-CoV-2. But then the vaccines came very quickly upon us. And we were able to track down, as our patients started getting their vaccines as soon as they were available, in mid-December in New York City. And as it started opening up, first from healthcare workers to patients who had, who otherwise met the age requirement, and also comorbidities. And then it opened up officially on February 17th to include all IBD patients. So we were able to track down the first almost 50 patients who had received vaccines. And these were all patients who received either the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine. So we were able to take a look and see what was going on. We don't have a lot of measures, but one of these measures to see whether patients made antibodies appropriately to the vaccines. Essentially what we've been able to see is that all of the patients who received both doses, completed their vaccine schedules, have all made antibodies. So, that's great news, right? Despite the medications that they're on, these are all patients who are on in biologics, essentially, and as well as some of the other medications given for IBD. And so we were really, really pleased to see that, and excited for our patients.
So Jim, I must say that this is mostly about patients who are on anti-TNF, and especially infliximab or vedolizumab. Serre-Yu, maybe you could comment on these studies, who came from UK, the Clarity study, and also a study on transplants, who brought a lot of anxiety to our patients, and clarify what's the difference between those studies and our results, and what we know today.
Yeah, there were 2 major studies that came out. That one was from the UK, this beautiful study of many IBD patients. And what they had reported that for IBD patients who were infected with SARS-CoV-2, that patients who were receiving infliximab or anti-TNFs were not able to generate antibodies as well or to as high of levels as patients who were on vedolizumab or Entyvio. This created, understandably a huge amount of concern amongst all of us. Now, the important points from that study to point out, though, however, was number one, it's not a vaccine study. And we know from science that our immune response to an infection is actually quite different from our immune response to a vaccine, right? And the vaccines that we're so far getting, you're just getting exposed to one part of that high dose, but one part of that virus. And the second point is that they actually tested for antibodies that are different from the ones that would be expected to be generated by the vaccine. So it's a little complicated and technical, but I think by now we've all been well versed in the parts of the coronavirus. Yes. But what they tested for were nucleocapsid antibodies. But actually all of these vaccines that we're right now talking about target the spike protein. And so there may actually well be differences in how the body responds to spike protein versus nucleocapsid, and also like the duration of antibody response and level of antibody response. So, we took that actually with somewhat of a grain of salt, but understandably, in the wider community, I think it caused a lot of concern. The second paper was about transplant, post-transplant patients who would receive solid organ transplant, another great study from Hopkins. So they, all of their patients are receiving immunosuppression. Some of those medications overlap, namely azathioprine. Some of those patients were receiving that, and that overlaps with IBD, but otherwise didn't quite as much. So they get suppressed in different ways immunologically. However, they reported less of an antibody response, but this was after one dose of vaccine. And that's actually a very important point. And what we stress is that just complete the 2 doses. That's the important point.
Yeah, I think that's very good that we went into that because, these come up. The patients are asking about these studies, and it's very difficult to explain how incomplete a lot of this data is. And without the double vaccination, different medications, and actually the way it's reported, they're equating natural exposure to a virus where the dose can be different, the host can be different, the immune response can be different. So it's very different than the controlled vaccination where we know. And that's why the work that you've just published is so important. And it leads me to the next question is just, based on your findings with the antibody response among our patients on predominantly anti-TNFs, are these patients going to be protected by the vaccines, do you think?
I hope so. We don't have that data yet. That data will take time for us to sort out, and that's because once everybody has received their vaccine, we need to allow for a certain amount of time to actually understand its clinical efficacy. We can measure antibodies, we can measure other responses, which is another point I think I forgot to make, which is that vaccines don't just induce antibodies, they also induce other parts of the immune system that aren't measured by antibodies. So not to forget that part. There's a large part of the immune response we're not testing here.
But I would want to mention to our audience, though, that if the measure in the clinical trials for the vaccines was primarily an antibody response, and it appears as if these patients who are getting the biologic therapies are having a comparable response after the second injection. So the assumption should be their protection should be the same.
Yes. So
again,
exactly.
I want to have that out there because I think the certainty about it is, obviously needs to be played out in real time. But if the levels are comparable.
What we can say is that when we looked at all of our patients who had achieved an antibody response after 2 doses of vaccination, the majority of them, almost 90% of them, actually had high enough antibody levels that would have we don't have a full measure, but would have actually qualified them for plasma donation, convalescent plasma donation, right? So that actually, and that requires high titers technically.
Yeah. So
So
I think, Jim, we can say that those levels are compatible with protection. So
correct.
very reassuring message again. After 2 shots, you are very likely to be protected. But very importantly as well, not after 1 shot.
Right.
So you have to be cautious. After 1 shot, you are not fully protected, right? Something else that so Jim, the point that it's just emerging data, we need to collect more data about more drugs, about steroids, about the new oral molecules, tofacitinib, other biologics. We need to collect also data about all vaccines available. And I think, Serre-Yu, you should comment, because Serre-Yu is a PI with my friend Jacques Satsangui from UK, of a beautiful international study, which is called ICARUS, which is funded by Helmsley, which is looking at serology against, SARS-CoV serology across all countries, all continents. And patients from those different countries, especially India, Japan, and Brazil, are facing different variants first, and second, they will be receiving different vaccines. So I think at the end, maybe in 1 year, we will have the full picture. It's still preliminary.
So listen, Serre-Yu, when you looked at this group of patients, did you notice any unique safety issues? Were there any different safety issues that arose in the 50 patients who are being infused, that you noticed any signals that came up?
None at all. When we looked at side effect profiles, they were on par with our healthy controls. There were no severe adverse reactions in this group, albeit small numbers. And so, no.
No, but this is a good point, Jim, because Serre-Yu, remember when we started, we were worrying, for instance, in patients who got some kind of infusion reaction with biologics, in the past, we were worrying what will happen to those patients, what will be the tolerance. But so far, we have not seen anything, right?
Yeah, it's been great. And I've not seen any. And I'm going to say every last one of my patients has been vaccinated, and it's been going very smoothly, and we've all been reassured. So in closing, maybe both of you can give me some thoughts on the ongoing research projects that you see looking at this question and what we can expect to see over the coming months. Serre-Yu?
Big question. We're looking forward to, we need to get more data and more patients and follow them for longer periods of time. In this way, we can answer the actual question of the efficacy, as we can see over time, how much patients are protected, who does or does not get infected, for example, after vaccination. We'll also be able to give you more information, hopefully, on the different vaccines and what kinds of immune responses that they give, what the effects of medications are, and, especially as we get more and more patients who are vaccinated. I think these will inevitably be the kind of information that's going to come out.
So, Jim, from a clinical perspective, you asked the good question. We need to get data about protection, right? Because so far, a Serre-Yu study was a serological study. It was not an epidemiological study. But I think we will very soon, get the data about efficacy. And the second question, Jim, is for how long? For how long will our patients and ourselves actually be protected? Yeah. And will there be a problem with the new variants emerging? So far, Serre-Yu, correct me if I'm wrong, there is no evidence that patients and others are not protected against the variants present in US, at least. But this is an evolving science, so we still need to be cautious about that.
Thank you so much for joining us. This is Dr. James Marion for the third Thursday broadcast on Zoom from the Feinstein IBD Center at Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York City. Thank you, and join us again next month.